Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this webinar this morning. Today, we are going to have the opportunity to learn about one of the newest diseases in soybean that's kind of taken over parts of Illinois, a little bit of Missouri, and into Indiana, and that is red crown rot. So presenting today will be the Beck's Hybrids Agronomy Education Lead, Dr. Matt Montgomery, and Matt is probably one of the most experienced agronomists in the industry when it comes to dealing with red crown rot. He happens to live and work in a territory right in the epicenter of the start of red crown rot, and he's had quite a few years of experience looking at the disease, diagnosing the disease, and gathering learnings about the disease of red crown rot. So Dr. Montgomery will share his experience with us today and some management tactics if you are in an area with a concern of red crown rot. A couple housekeeping things here this morning. Most participants are muted, so if you have a question, there is a chat box that you can utilize to ask questions. We'll moderate that as we go. If you're calling in or mobile this morning, feel free to text me directly at 309-373-7623, and we can ask the questions directly through the text line. So again, that's 309-373-7623. Matt's got a good presentation for us here this morning, so we'll work through that and take it away, Dr. Montgomery.
Okay, John, just call out when you feel like it's time for questions or if we have a glitch. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in this morning. As I said a couple months ago, I'm going to welcome you to the Montgomery family basement. This is a place in the corner where I throw up a bunch of bookshelves and pretend like it's a study or an office. So it's my little corner of the world. And want to really thank you for tuning in here on this disease. And want to start out. I'm going to flip to the first slide and just verify for me, John, that you see that first slide now.
Yes, sir. Looks good.
Great. Okay, we're going to talk about this new disease, or this more recently that I throw out some words of caution. This is a disease worth paying attention to. It's a disease worth us respecting, but I want to make sure we don't panic and call everything out in the field red crown rot. And so I want to make sure that part of what we do today is that we get this thing identified correctly. And so I'm flashing up here on the screen kind of your first example of what the disease looks like. We're going to come back to some pictures like this. And as we get started here, need to do a little bit of thanks. These are all pictures that have been submitted to us by growers, by customers, and just a big tip of the hat to those of you that gave me those photos to use in this presentation. Also, before we begin, we all need to acknowledge the real foundational work that has been done by Dr. Nathan Kolcheski, Dr. Carl Bradley, Dr. Talenko, and others. A lot of what I will reference is some of the material that they have actually developed over time, information that they have presented over time. And so they've created a foundation that we should all be very, very thankful for. One other thing that I think is important for us to keep in mind as we're studying this disease or learning a little bit more about this disease, I think the pathogen story and row crop production has changed quite a bit. When I was just coming out of school 30 years ago, for instance, in corn, we had one major disease that we worried about. We worried about maybe gray leaf spot, and half the time we didn't do anything for it. And over the course of time, that story has changed. If you think to the corn side of things, we've moved from just gray leaf spot to now where we have 4 different diseases on the table. The spectrum has changed. The story has changed quite a bit. And I think you're seeing the same thing happen in beans. We used to only worry about soybean cyst nematodes, sudden death syndrome, and now we have this new player that's creating an interesting dynamic. It does not mean that we take our eye off of soybean cyst nematode and sudden death syndrome. Those are still big diseases. Up in the north, you could add white mold on there too. But the way this disease hits a field in the bulk of the Beck's footprint, the way it hits fields is significant enough that some people are going to be orienting their management more towards that disease than some other things, and understandably so. I think we're going to be running into increasingly what I call driver diseases. We kind of had a one size fits all way that we approached pathology in the field. And for instance, in corn, we've got this significant change happening where tar spot and other things come in late, and we're beginning to wonder, does that change the timing for fungicides away from that tassel time application to maybe something that's a little bit later? I think in beans, we have that same story developing. If I feel like I have red crown rot, that becomes the dominant disease that I'm really orienting towards. It doesn't mean I ignore everything else, but it does mean that the dynamic has changed and things have become much more complicated over the last few years. It's not the simple story or more simple story that it once was. And so I want us to continue to keep our eyes on those pests. And it's another reason why I want us to make sure we get the disease identified correctly and not cry wolf. So I want to introduce you just a little bit to the disease, and I'm going to do that first off with some numbers. And I recognize fully that those numbers won't do it for everybody. Some of you are going to see these numbers and you're going to go, well, in a bad year, I run into numbers that are kind of tough like that anyway. I get that. I want you to begin to see the numbers, and then I'm going to come back to some other graphics that I think will drive home the unique yield reducing power of this pest. So this graphic right here was given to me by a grower. He sent me a picture of his yield monitor. I'm going to concentrate on the stuff on the left-hand side of the screen first. You can see there probably the big point is, in my experience, and as I visit with growers, this number of 40 to 60% losses to beans in the most severe cases continues to come up. I think that's a number that has truth to it. You're going to hear me talk about my experience today. That's really where most of us are. It's what have we experienced rather than lots and lots of hard research. I think you can hang your hat on a lot of things that I'm going to say today. This is one of them. If it comes into your field and it hits really hard, you can be looking at 40 to 60% losses. We know there's stories in the past of 60 bushel fields being slashed down to 16. We know from the areas that I've kind of interacted with growers in, that people, for instance, over in Pike County, Illinois, where this thing got started, have said, until you find a solution, I'm not raising beans. I can't afford to do it. The hit is too severe. And some of those parts of the world are not really parts of the world that are ideal for us to raise corn on corn. It's just not really set up that way. So you can begin to sense some of the issues that growers run into. Also, kind of a unique thing, because this is new to the Midwest and because it probably hasn't really been a huge emphasis in soybean production up to this point, I would say that some of the information we have is a little fuzzy. I want to be a little careful about how boldly we make statements about what this disease does or doesn't like, because I've seen some things in the field that make you question some of those more bold statements. And then also, because it's new to the Midwest and a real new focus for us, there's really lacking management information. And so we're going to toss out some ideas, but I'm going to just say here, it's no silver bullets for managing this disease. We are still a little bit away from the silver bullet that pulls this thing back under control. Let's look at some of those numbers, though. So let's do it by the numbers. And the first number I want you to notice is that in this case, the grower hit a rough spot in the field, and it slashed that yield down in that bad spot for red crown rot to less than 10 bushel. And I know some of you are going to say, well, I have a spot in the field that gets hit by deer, for instance, and I can see something even worse than that. I get it. I just want you to pay attention to numbers like this. And I'm going to drive home the way we need to respect this disease and really appreciate its yield reducing power a little bit more down the road. In this case also, you'll notice that this 60 to 70 bushel field got slashed down to about 30 bushels. So again, that 40 to 60% yield loss story that I was talking about. Again, a pretty unique disease outside of maybe white mold or unchecked weed pressure. We don't see other pests. Even soybean cyst nematode does not cut yield the way that this thing does. This is our first example of maybe a little bit of fuzziness around the story of what this disease likes. Now, there's been some recent research that says that the pest, the pathogen responsible for this, really likes warmer soil temperatures. And I believe that's true. I'm sure that's probably right. If you look at some of the older literature, though, I've got sitting over here on my left what's called a compendium of soybean diseases. It's kind of my soybean disease Bible that I go back to even after all these years. And that reference, they had a real broad temperature range that they say red crown rot liked. I would tell you that I'm going to hold on to all that loosely. It may be true that the pace of progress of that disease really kicks up to its highest degree at those higher temperatures. But I have seen early planted fields and late planted fields, a variety of soil temperatures succumb to some pretty big hits from this disease. So I would hold that story about about what kind of temperatures we have to have loosely. Yes, maybe you can see in some research that the pace kind of hits its prime at warmer soil temperatures. I'm going to tell you, in my experience, I've seen it do plenty good, have a plenty good time, plenty hard time on the crop at a variety of soil temperatures. You also may hear people say this happened at the beginning when I first ran into this disease. Oh, this is just a clay loving soil. So you got a lot of clay hillsides over there in Pike County that are prone to stay wet, and that's why it's showing up there. I do think this disease likes moisture, but I also want to say I can hop in the vehicle. I can drive 15 miles from home to some flat, black, prime Sangamon County, Illinois ground, some of the highest cash rent ground in the area. And I can find this disease getting a pretty good foothold in a field. So do not grab a hold of the idea that this thing likes clay and it's not going to come visit you because maybe you're a little bit more prime producing ground. I think it can hit just about anywhere. And there's some more slides that we'll show here in a bit that tell that same story. Also, I'm going to kind of say that I think this is a moisture loving disease. I think we can say that, but it doesn't have to be a lot of moisture. This disease, if it's a dry year, it will appear and maybe not appear at yield reducing levels. So it can still appear in a fairly dry year. In my experience, I've seen that. You can hang your hat on that. But the kind of moisture that it needs really is just enough moisture to produce a soybean crop, a decent soybean crop. We don't have to have excess moisture for this thing to go crazy. It's true that it will kind of initially really seem to get going kind of in the valleys of the field, in the kind of lower spots of the field. Sometimes those are a little bit more prone, but you don't have to have a ton of moisture to get this disease rolling. Let's talk just a little bit about history, because I think that's an important part of this. So this is new to the Midwest. It's not a new disease as if it has not been spotted before. Again, just a picture to kind of prime you up and keep you interested and have you kind of appreciate what this disease kind of looks like out in the field. So this disease was kind of originally a disease in peanuts called black rot. And this is the fact sheet from North Carolina on that. And initially kind of middle part of the 60s appearing there, through the 70s, worked its way through the southern part of the United States in peanuts. It is kind of interesting. About the time that I was born, so the early 70s, this thing hopped over to beans. And you can see there on the screen our fact sheet on red crown rot from Beck. So if you want to look at that, pretty easy to find. Just go in and type on Google red crown rot of soybeans, Beck's, and you'll be able to find this fact sheet. About 50 years ago, the thing hopped over to beans. It was first identified in soybeans, having moved over to beans in Japan. But by about the early 70s, it was appearing in beans in the southern United States, working its way throughout the southern United States. And it kind of just lingered there until here the last few years. Up to 2018, this is the distribution that you would have seen out in the field. There's another resource, again, sitting over here on my left, called A Farmer's Guide to Soybean Diseases. It's a little tamer resource than that compendium of soybean diseases that I mentioned to you earlier. And I took that picture and I just kind of redid it because trying to scan it was a pretty fuzzy picture. This is the distribution that we had up to 2018. The areas that we know we had red crown rot appearing in soybeans. And then all of a sudden in 2018, you have this blip, this sudden observation in the Pike County, Illinois area, near a little town called Eldera that sits just a little bit north and west of Pittsfield, Illinois. And the story kind of goes like this. I visited with this gentleman, and his daughter was doing some field crop scouting for him. She was out looking at some beans, kind of a hillside type field, and she noticed some symptoms that kind of did not match up with sudden death syndrome. So it looked like sudden death. It had yellowing between the veins, browning between the veins, but the plant seemed to be declining quickly and the leaves seemed to be remaining attached. It just didn't look quite right to be sudden death. And so they called out their local FS. The local FS took a look, scratched their heads, and said, boy, this looks odd. It doesn't really look like sudden death syndrome. They called out Growmark. Growmark took a look. Looks odd, scratched their heads. That pulled in University of Illinois and Dr. Kolcheski, and he identified it as the first confirmed case of red crown rot in the Midwest. Now, since that period of time, the disease has kind of advanced, or I should say observations of the disease have advanced. A lot of observations to the east of that initial spot there in Pike County, outside of Eldera. Even into 2022, 2024, most of those observations have been to the east. You can find it now up in the suburbs of Chicago. You can find it down into Kentucky. You can find it on the border of Indiana and Ohio. You can find it across kind of that central band of Illinois, again, across some prime ground. It really is this odd kind of eastern observation pattern rather than western observation pattern. Now, in the last year, it finally did start to pick up some observations to the west, but it's very intriguing that the disease just appeared barely to the west. It appeared right across the river from Quincy, Illinois, one of those locations being near Palmyra, which is not really that far from Quincy proper. So it moved to the west, but not very far. And that's kind of interesting to me and intriguing to me, this more eastward observation than westward observation. And just to drive that point home, I'm going to kind of show what distribution looked like in 2022 in Pike County. And then I'm going to kind of show you this map on the right-hand side of the screen that's been developed by University of Illinois and then updated by Stephanie Porter at Illinois Soybean Association. If you look at the picture on the left, in my experience, you would go out and you could draw that line. You could have Eldera there in the middle and draw this red line kind of circling out from there. And all the observations in 2022 primarily were to the east of that line. I maybe could tap into an observation or two to the west, but everything seemed to be to the east. When you look at that distribution pattern in the state of Illinois, as of this date, again, very interesting, almost a spearhead with Pike County at the tip of that spear. It makes you wonder if there's not some kind of windblown component to this. That's not a popular statement to make. There's some reasons to doubt that some common mechanisms help move this thing around by wind. But I do think there might be a windblown component, and I'm going to make my argument for that as we go along. And I think actually that's not academic. That's not just something that's interesting to know. I think that's a real practical little bit of potential information for growers. And I'll come back to that here at the tail end of the presentation. So let's talk about the yield hit and the pace of field decline. I mentioned, I showed you earlier some numbers. And I mentioned, I know some of you can run into rough spots caused by other things, and those numbers don't really ring the bell, as I've said before. So I'm going to show you some yield maps that I do think will ring that bell for you. I think they are staggering and really impressive and give you pause and help you to appreciate this disease. Now I'm going to show you this, and I want to say, as we get ready to do that, I don't want to instill panic. Again, we respect this disease, but we get it identified correctly and we don't scream that the sky is falling. It is appearing in more places. It is doing what you're going to see here in more places, but it's not doing it everywhere. We need to be conscious of it, keep our eye on it, etc. So I'm going to flip to the first set of graphics. This was given to me by a grower. And I'll just pause there for a second. That is incredibly dramatic. It is really hard to think of another disease, another pest outside of unchecked weed pressure that can have that kind of yield reducing power on the story of a field. To go from green, where we're hitting 70, maybe upper 60s, but 70s probably more likely, to in 2 years' time, when we come back to beans, to have that field struggling to clear 20. That is dramatic. And it is really hard to think of another pest that does this. Again, our friends in the north part of the Beck's footprint are going to mention white mold. Yep, that's a good example. For most of the Beck's footprint, it's going to be unchecked weed pressure. That's the only thing that can do this kind of story to a field. Again, just to make the case that this isn't a one-off, this is another story. You'll notice in 2022 in that field, there's a little kind of crimson dot, kind of upper center on the screen. That's the initial spot that they noticed red crown rot in. And one cycle later in 2024, this is what had happened to the field. Again, struggling to hit 20 bushel. Got another picture here, again, submitted by a grower. Below, on the other side of the tree line is where red crown rot was. On the north side of that tree line is where it was not. And you can see that dramatic difference just in one field, the potential that we were hitting in most of that field and what happened to yield. Again, dropping down in some cases, in this example, less than 10 bushel, pretty dramatic. And just to make my point, the only thing that really can slash yield like this is unchecked weed pressure. Here on the right-hand side of the screen is actually sat down with Dr. Aaron Hager a little while back, and he gave me, kind of sent these links to me. Land-grant universities have actually, from time to time, had great comparisons of weed-free and weed inundated, and it's a 40 to 60% hit. Again, the only thing that seems to surpass what red crown rot can do when it's really bad is unchecked weed pressure. So I also want to talk a little bit about pace of plant decline. I need to thank Mr. Roderman for giving me these photos. I think these are absolutely incredible. They tell a really good time-lapse story. I'm going to talk about this being in the course of about 5 to several days. I've seen this kind of decline in about 5 to several days. It at least tells that story. So you'll notice here in this photograph that we have a spot with red crown rot. You can see some of those symptoms that I mentioned earlier. The plants have declined rapidly. They had sudden death-like syndrome symptoms, and then they died, and they're beginning to shrink back to about a half to maybe about a third of their normal size. They're a brown husk, and the leaves you can kind of pick up on are still attached, which is unlike SDS. I'm going to draw a couple boxes around 3 spots, and I want us to kind of pay attention to those 3 spots as we pay attention to the right-hand side of the screen. Because again, I think it helps you appreciate pace. So, there we go. Okay, that's the same location. I'm going to put those boxes back in. And again, I'm just going to pause. Look at the decline. I've seen this kind of decline happen in the course of several days. Fairly green plants just showing a little bit of symptomology, suddenly declining like this in just a few days' time. That's, again, very dramatic. And you can imagine how that translates into a field as a whole. I've seen a corner, in my experience, a corner or an edge of the field or a pocket of this, and in about 3 weeks' time, large swaths of the field are looking like that center brown section that you see on the right. And in some cases, I can think of one grower down in the New Canton, Illinois area. The plants were so declined that he had nothing but morning glories in that corner of the field, and he just didn't even cut that part of the field because there was nothing there. That's the pace of plant decline that we're talking about. Very dramatic. And of course, because these kind of symptoms are starting to develop toward that early August to mid-August period, you can imagine what that means for pod fill. That's a real critical period of time. Remember, we still have a long ways to go about the time you hit mid-August, about state fair time in the state of Illinois for soybean yield. We're only about halfway through. at that point. And we're talking about this disease causing plant death right ahead of that. Because of that, and I'm going to kind of circle or draw a hexagon around some spots here. Look at what that does to those pods. Flat pods. You can imagine the quality of seed that we're getting out of this. They're shriveled, they're shrunken, they're split. In my experience, I have been surprised that we could even get stuff into the hopper because they are so bad. And that also brings up a whole nother layer of issues with this. That's an income issue for a grower. It's slashing yield for a grower, slashing income potential. But imagine also what this means for a seed company. If this disease lands in your back door where you are trying to raise seed beans, and this is the kind of quality that you're getting out of this, that has huge implications for the industry as a whole. Again, you can understand why this disease is being respected at such a level by growers and by the industry, why it has raised eyebrows. Let's talk about within season development just a little bit. I showed you pace of plant decline, but if we're talking about these symptoms appearing early to mid-August, what things are going to catch your eye? The first thing I should say is this is not a windshield observation disease, but you do need to pay attention as you're driving by through the windshield. Kind of keep your eye on things. I think the first thing that might give you pause to stop and look as you're glancing through the windshield are symptoms that kind of look like this from a distance. When you see red crown rot in the field, it's an intertangled mix of dead, yellow, and healthy plants. And that, again, is a little bit different feel than something like sudden death syndrome. Some of you that remember some of our big sudden death syndrome outbreaks in the late 90s, early 2000s, will remember that you had large sections, large areas, regions of the field that kind of just looked uniformly bad, uniformly yellowed up, and then uniformly browned. That's not really the field level symptomology that you get with red crown rot, in my experience. Instead, you get healthy plants, dead plants, green plants, all mixed together. And it's a little bit more messy looking than what sudden death syndrome is. That should make you stop and get out of the vehicle and go into the field and start looking around. And so then here's the next layer of symptoms that you're going to pay attention for. The picture on your left is actually sudden death syndrome, but you're going to pay attention for sudden death syndrome-like symptoms. You can see there in the center pane, sudden death syndrome-like symptoms as well. I will say, when we talk about sudden death versus red crown, sometimes when I have seen sudden death syndrome in the field, again, in my experience, it seems like that region between the veins is yellow-brown, but the vein area of the leaf and the area right around it stays kind of glossy green, at least at first. Sometimes when red crown rot has hit, I felt like because the plant is declining so rapidly, you almost have a grain of that area around the leaf vein. So you don't have that glossy green. Sometimes you'll have almost a grain. Don't try to memorize that so much. I would say that's worth keeping in the back of your mind if you're more familiar with sudden death as kind of way to pick out differences. If you're not as familiar, just remember it's got sudden death-like symptoms. That's, again, an indicator that red crown rot or something else might be at work. When you get into the field, again, you're going to see those plants that have died with the leaves still attached. That's a real critical one. The plants are going to shrink again to about a third of their normal size. Leaves are going to remain attached. With sudden death, they tend to shed those leaves, and you wind up with this porcupine-like plant of sticks and no leaves attached. That's not what happens really at the beginning with red crown rot. At the beginning with red crown rot, the leaves are still attached as that plant dies. This stuff becomes much more definitive. Now, on the left is kind of. So don't hang your hat on seeing red being the indication that red crown rot is on there. But you can, with this disease, down toward the soil profile, down towards the soil horizon, you can see a reddening discoloration of that lower stem. Again, that begins to check the box as another possibility for this being red crown rot. I want to be careful we don't grab a hold of that one tightly because there are some other things that could cause reddening But reddening down low like this does begin to raise the question marks about the potential for red crown rot. On the right-hand side of the screen is the stuff that's definitive. You're going to get down at soil level and you're going to look about an inch above and below the soil line. And you're going to look for these little red fruiting structures that we call parathecia. They are spore producing structures, kind of pinhead sized, very small. And there's not anything else in the Midwest that should do this. So if you spot these, you know you have red crown rot. Those little fruiting structures are not going to appear on every plant. You're going to have to look around on a few plants, several plants, and then after a bit, your eye will become accustomed to it. You will be able to spot them much more easily. If it is a dry year, you may have to dig up those plants gently and shake off, gently take the soil off at horizon and kind of look just under the soil profile, just under that topsoil to kind of see those little red structures. But this is identifying. If you see those little red orangish bulbs on the lower part of the plant, that's red crown rot. That's what kind of identifies the disease. You also need to know, though, that you have a very limited period of time to find those definitive symptoms. Early August to mid-August is really the time period that we're talking about. As we get to late August, those parathecia are going to collapse. They're going to dry down, and it's going to be much harder to spot them. I should mention on the screen here, you see some white mold growing. And I've had people sometimes say, oh, I think that must be red crown rot. I think in a lot of cases, what you are seeing when you see this white mold is you're seeing a saprophyte. You're seeing a dead feeding fungus. It's just coming in and feeding on the dead material that's been killed off by something. There's also a salmon-colored disease, kind of an orangish, pinkish fungus that's growing on the plant. Again, I think that is more of a saprophyte. I don't think that is red crown rot that has actually changed over time. I think it's actually a saprophyte just feeding on dead stuff. It's not indicative of red crown. If we get to late August, early September, those little parathecia will have collapsed so much that they're going to get whiskery thin in appearance. And you're lucky, maybe with some glasses in my case, to be able to spot those as little maroon whiskers on the lower stem. That's what you're going to spot. Really tiny and really limited period of time even to spot that. By the time we get too deep into September, your possibilities for identifying this visually are just frankly over. So a real limited period of time to spot this thing. I want to spend some time talking about the life cycle of red crown rot because I think there's some important stories here, again, that eventually, as we wrap up the presentation, are going to maybe increase the comfort level or the ability to sleep level for those of you that are growers that are listening today. This is what the life cycle looks like. And I've mapped out here spring, late July, early August, late summer, and fall. We start out as what's called a microsclerotia with red crown rot. Now, if that term sclerotia sounds familiar, it should, because if you're in the northern part of the Beck's footprint, we're talking about little knots, in some cases kind of like eraser head sized knots of fungal hair with white mold that persist in the field from season to season as sclerotia. Again, about eraser sized little black things. And those are really hardy. They allow the disease to persist minus ideal conditions until those ideal humid conditions come along. Think about taking those sclerotia and just shrinking them down in size to be microsclerotia. And that's what we have with red crown rot. Little tiny knots of fungal hair that persist in the soil and allow this disease to survive for long periods of time minus a host. We think that can be 4 to 7 years. We've had a chance, or I've had the experience of visiting with some folks who have said that. They think it's 4 to 7 years time that it can survive minus a host. We know by the end of the season, more of those microsclerotia are going to be produced. So these microsclerotia aren't produced like every 20 days or something like that. They start out in the spring. We'll have infection of that soybean root. And by the end of the season, we're going to have more microsclerotia produced. But I want to go through just a little bit more here in a second, and I really want to map out that life cycle. I think this also gives you pause about this disease. I just told you that 4 to 7 years minus a host. Dr. Carl Bradley and Dr. Klucheski will lay out a map of different plants that this thing can feed on that kind of looks like this. So notice it's got a very broad host range. It can persist on alfalfa. It can even show up on blueberries. We've already talked about peanuts and members of the pea family. My point is, if it can survive 4 to 7 years and it has a really broad host range, I don't think you're getting rid of it, eliminating it from a field. I think once it's in your field, it's going to become part of the landscape of that field, and it's not going to disappear because it can survive a long time and just wait for ideal conditions, and it can survive on other things. Okay, let's work through the growing season, because again, I think this is important. It begins, I want to kind of explain one of the reasons we're going to talk about this life cycle is that I talked about that more eastward appearance of the disease that makes you wonder about wind-blown movement. And I think we need to explore the life cycle a little bit, partly to start thinking about that and what might be a mechanism that allows that to happen. So you have microsclerotia in the spring, the soil warms up, they start to kind of become active. They sense the root nearby, probably the root's releasing something like exudates that signal that fungus that it's near. And that is enough for it to send out little hairs that kind of bore their way into the root, and they work their way into the cortex of the root system. And then they're going to just kind of sit there for the rest of the season until we hit about late July. About late July, as it's lingering in the root, these fungi, the little fungal hairs, are going to release toxins. They're going to flow up to the upper part of the plant, kind of like what happens with sudden death. Actually, the path of infection with sudden death is a very good kind of model to keep in mind for the timing of this disease. Sudden death infects in the spring, so does red crown rot. Sudden death doesn't show any symptoms until we hit kind of that July period, late July period, early August period. It's the same thing for red crown rot. Late July, it sends those toxins up, and you get those SDS-like symptoms, that interveinal chlorosis and necrosis, yellowing and browning on that leaf tissue. And then what we're going to have at some point are some little mushroom-like structures produced. They're going to belt out little asexual spores. In the lab, Dr. Klucheski will talk about some of the spores that we harvest off of this thing. He's been able to get them to produce the disease in the lab. A lot of questions about what they're actually doing in the field, if they're helping to maybe just move the disease around on the plant itself, or if they're helping to move it around otherwise. So we really don't know what happens with those spores. Are they a real big mechanism for movement or not throughout the field as a whole, or is it much more just fueling infection of that individual plant? And then we wind up with those little red fruiting structures that I talked about earlier called perithecia. And they're going to belt out sexual spores. And again, question marks about what's going on there. Does the disease actually move around in the field with these spores, or does it just move around on the plant itself? And by late summer, we're going to have more of those microsclerotia produced. And that really is going to seed the next year's problem. They'll overwinter, and it will create that problem for us for growing seasons to come. Okay, John, do we need to pause here for a second and see if there's any questions?
Will you be touching on management tactics such as tillage, rotation, things of that nature?
Yeah, let's remind me that as we kind of get to the tail end here. And yes, we will be talking about a lot of those points, but if I would miss one of those, just bring me back around to that.
One question I got over the text lines that may be pertinent now is outside of host crops that may be conducive to disease development, are there host weed species
Yeah,
that
I need.
can thrive?
Yeah, I'm assuming that there are with that kind of, I mean, 110 plus species. I'm assuming there are some weed species that this thing can go on. And so weed management is a big part of management for this disease in my mind. It's not going to solve the disease, but I do think weed management is going to be important. I probably would need to dig in a little bit more, John, to get you some specifics on weeds that we think are really prime for harboring red crown.
Very good. I'll fit in the rest of the questions as you close with management strategies here later.
Sounds great. Thank you. I do want to go through now some relationships. You know, there are some questions. John began to hint at some of these, you know, tillage questions, for instance, but there's other questions on the table too. What about soil fertility? Is there any relationship there? I'm going to give you my experience. It's my experience. It's what I've noticed as I've worked with growers. I think still, though, a lot of this you can hang your hat on, at least at this point, you can. What about soybean cyst nematode? Is there some kind of relationship there? And what about planting date? Um, I'm not sure that graphs are the best way for me to talk through this, but I threw out a couple hypothetical graphs to kind of give you some visuals for what my experience has been. I want to kind of talk through relationships here, but don't get so hung up on the graphs as much as just listen to what I'm kind of conveying to you on these points. You know, if we saw a strong relationship with something in the field, for instance, kind of predisposing it to red crown rot, you would expect when we sampled the red crown rot area and we sampled the non-red crown rot area of that field, we'd have huge differences in those numbers, right? If you graphed it out with a bar chart, those bar charts should be really tall in one case and really short in another. There should be obvious differences in the numbers that you're peeling off of those fields. If there's not really, you would expect something like this. Maybe the bar graphs are very similar. Maybe one time the non-red crown rot area is high, the red crown rot area is low, and the next time it's reverse. The red crown rot area is high and the non-red crown rot area is low. You'd kind of have a mess of bars, not that obvious difference between the height of those bars in the graphic. So, in my experience, when we talk about pH and organic matter, I think it's much more that absent trend. It has been very hard to peel off a relationship between pH and organic matter with the limited observations I've had on soil tests. One time you feel like you're seeing a little higher pH, but maybe a lot of times there's just a lot of similarity in pH. I already mentioned to you that I've got plenty of just anecdotal evidence that this disease doesn't really think you have to have low organic matter versus high. It seems to kind of like a variety of organic matter levels. So on the pH and organic matter front, I'm going to say at this point, my experience has been not much of a relationship. And you can see I'm kind of labeling it as Matt's experience there on the bottom right. I do not feel like I've seen a relationship there. What about P and K though? So P and K, it's not the strong relationship that I've seen in other cases, but it does sometimes seem like there's a little something there. The red crown rot areas seem to have a little bit more P and K than the non-crown rot areas. And you might be tempted to jump out of that and say, that's causation. It's the high fertility that's really cranking up that field to see red crown rot. But I want to caution us just a little bit. This is kind of my walkthrough here again. I don't think organic matter levels really influence whether we see red crown rot or not, at least not in a way that matters substantially. I don't think pH levels, in my experience up to this point, are driving the disease. I do see this high P1 level thing showing up sometimes, higher, I should say, where we have red crown rot. I do see K levels a little higher where we have red crown rot. But it seems like most of the time, this is the area that we're sampling from. And I think there's a really good argument to be made that the reason we're seeing higher P and K levels where we had really bad red crown rot is we simply aren't pulling any beans off of that area. We're not pulling any P and K off and taking it into the elevator. I think that is why we're seeing some slightly elevated P and K levels in those red crown rot areas. I think it's much more indicative of the fact that we had nothing but dead husks out there. We didn't really produce much tail end of the season in the way of a plant. We really didn't produce much seed. What about soybean cyst nematode and red crown rot in Matt's experience? The fact that this has appeared in peanuts is actually kind of helpful because we can look at their management strategies and we can kind of consider whether those might be management strategies that might help us out. In peanuts, when we're talking about black rot, the version of this disease that appears in peanuts, they're primarily going to varieties that hold off the disease better. They're making sure there's some fungicide in the soil in proximity to the seed, and they're managing nematodes. That's kind of their go-to 3-point strategy for managing this disease in peanuts. And so it makes you wonder, is there a good argument to be made that maybe managing soybean cyst nematode will help us out? Or have we seen higher soybean cyst nematode counts where we've had red crown rot? This has been my experience. Again, if I had to map it out, I suppose it would look something like this. Yeah, sometimes I do see a little higher soybean cyst nematode count where I've had red crown rot. A lot of times it's pretty hard to pick out a difference. And I think it goes back to what we talked about earlier. For most of the time that we've been in this industry, soybean cyst nematode has been the driver disease, and it's really spread throughout the Midwest. It is present in a lot of fields, and actually, I would argue, is increasing in number. We're seeing a lot more soybean cyst nematode pressure than what we used to. And so I think it's really hard to piece out if there's a relationship there, because you're dealing with this kind of overall high background level of soybean cyst nematode in fields. And while we're on that point, again, I want to, if you got red crown rot, yep, that is a big one, probably the big dog that we need to pay attention to. For those of you that don't have red crown rot, though, it's still soybean cyst nematode. This is a resource, again, that you can access from Beck's on soybean cyst nematode. It shows that distribution map of soybean cyst nematode in the United States, and it shows some research that shows how soybean cyst nematode is kind of picking up steam on the primary source of resistance that we've used in the industry, PI 88788. And there's a real big need where we aren't fighting red crown, even where we are, but especially where we're not, to really make sure we're still thinking about soybean cyst nematode management and throwing other things out there. I want to make sure, again, that we're doing our due diligence here to generate a certain level of respect for the yield reducing power of red crown, but I don't want us to take our eye off of other pests as well. So again, I think this comes back to that point of driver diseases. I still intuitively think that when you have soybean cyst nematode, a microscopic roundworm that is wounding the root, you're creating pathways of entry and stress that allow the disease to kind of thrive a little bit better. I still think soybean cyst nematode management is important. I can't promise you, though, that soybean cyst nematode management will eliminate this disease. I can say we should be engaging in it, because I'm afraid if we don't, we'll make it worse. What about planting date? There's been a lot of talk about planting date's going to be the way to manage this thing. This, again, submitted by a grower, planted mid-April 2024, and this is early August. You can see the disease having a really good time there early August. And when we start yellowing up a field like this in early August, you can imagine the yield reducing potential that you can encounter. The other half of the story, in my experience, which again, I'm going to say you can hang your hat on, is that you could label this thing late May planted, and in some cases, double crop beans, and you can still see the same symptomology. I want to say clearly, I would not count on planting date being a magical cultural technique that's going to solve this thing. At this point in my experience, I do not feel comfortable saying that. I do not think that planting date is going to help us. I haven't seen it work consistently enough at this point. Okay, so that's a couple of kind of tie-ins for relationship. Fertility, pretty messy. Not really sure there's a relationship I can pick out there. Soybean cyst nematodes, still think it's worth managing, but hard to pick out a relationship. And I don't really feel like you can hang your hat on planting date solving this disease. I do want to talk now just a little bit about how could this thing spread from field to field. And I want to be very clear that these are Matt Montgomery's thoughts and speculations based on observation and just kind of sitting there at night wondering how this thing is getting around or being observed in so many areas that it hasn't been observed in before. Remember, we saw that predominant eastward movement. Remember also, when we looked at the graphic of the life cycle just a little bit earlier, we do have spores that are produced. Those spores are produced in season. They're not produced at the tail end of the season when the plants are all dried up, right? They're produced in season. And if they are blowing around and blowing from field to field, you would think there should be some patterns we can spot within the field that would hint at that. And so I'm going to try to represent this graphically. So if we had a diseased plant with red crown rot and it produced spores, and those spores were kind of launched out and carried by wind, they should kind of flow a distance and drop out, and then we should have a new spot in the field. And they should eventually produce spores that do the same. What I'm saying is, if you think of something like spider mite, for those of you that have seen spider mite problems in the past, spider mite, you'll have a really bad infestation on the edge of the field. And then a little bit later, you'll notice a little yellow spot that's dropped out. And that's because spider mites have sent out this little web balloon. They've been carried by the air from that initial point and dropped out into a new, otherwise healthy area. And you have this spatial difference, this kind of gap between where you see the symptoms. And that's what I really think. If this thing is moving around by those spores, I would think, just in my layman's mind, my agronomist mind, that I should see hot spot, large intervening area of green, and then maybe another hot spot. That should maybe be the symptom I'm seeing if this thing is really being wafted in the air as spores and carried across the Midwest. But we'll kind of come back to that here in a bit. What if it's more soil-borne, though? Well, if it's more soil-borne, there should be a pattern that we observe in the field that, to my mind, would look a little bit more like this. With tillage, we should see it kind of flow with the tillage pattern, right? From an initial spot stretched out, almost like what you see with soybean cyst nematode, right? These kind of long areas that kind of flow with soil movement in the field. Or there are areas that kind of stretch out from a common point. They should be connected more often than not. They shouldn't have those gaps that we saw if it was spores moving this thing around. I want to just look at some pictures, aerial photos that growers sent in, and kind of point out some things. You know, again, if you look at this photo right here, it really doesn't have that look of a hot spot and then an intervening healthy area and then a new little hot spot dropping out. This picture right here almost seems to be running lengthwise with the row, almost as if the planter pass or tillage work drug it out. It much more seems to be soil-borne, soil moved. You see that in this picture as well. And notice you can tell here that lower part of the field where it was a little bit more damp and it started going crazy there at first. But notice how it's running lengthwise with the planter pass, with the tillage work, if there was tillage work here. Same thing here again. You might be able to make some arguments that you see some spots up here that look like little spots being dropped out. But more often, the predominant symptom seems to be these areas that are kind of connected spatially. And here again, just notice how they almost have that oblong look, like you hit something and you drug it out with equipment. So I really think there's a much stronger argument that the way this thing's really moving within the field is much more moving with those microsclerotia getting drug out by equipment or planter passes or anything else that moves soil. Not so much that it's really spreading within the field itself by spores. And so if it's not spreading within the field itself by spores, it makes it really hard to argue that it's spreading field to field and across large geographies with spores. I should see evidence in the field itself that it's being spread by spores. And yet I see this eastward observation, right? Remember that spearhead kind of stretching out from Pike County, and lots of observations. Pike County's a hot area, Madison County's a hot area, but lots of observations kind of stretching out from that Pike County area. Not so much to the west, though, just barely getting to the west. It does feel like there's something windblown going on here. And I've begun to wonder if this might be the case. Again, here you see that eastward distribution. I've really begun to wonder if by chance, remember, anything that moves soil or anything that moves those microsclerotia moves this disease. I really begun to wonder if dust coming out the back of the combine, if we aren't blasting some of those microsclerotia out the back of the combine, sending them airborne and moving them across the countryside. That would explain why we don't see in-field movement that feels like spores, and yet we still have movement. And it would fit with kind of how this disease seems to work. And think back to your own experience with these clouds coming out the back of the combine. You know, you're talking about a few hundred feet in the air, that dust cloud went aloft and kind of hung there and drifted across the countryside. I think there might be something here, and I am eager to see if somebody dreams up a really good way to research this topic. But it's my go-to theory at the moment for how this disease is moving. I really think it's much more about microsclerotia drifting. Okay, now let's talk about seed treatments just a little bit. So I mentioned that there's really a three-pronged strategy when it comes to peanut production. It's picking out the right variety, making sure there's some fungicide in proximity to the seed, and then nematode management. You know as well as I know that there are some popular sudden death syndrome products in the marketplace that belong to a family. They belong to a family called the SDHI family. And I want to give you Matt Montgomery's experience, and I'm going to say clearly you can hang your hat on that experience. SDHI family, if you're familiar with some of our 3 mode of action foliar fungicide products in corn, a lot of those fancy new 3 mode of action products have an SDHI. And so what we're saying is that some of these SDHI seed treatments, for instance, Sultro is the one we use, they are the seed treatment version of that family. So they belong to that same family. This is pulled from Syngenta, and this is a public document that they have out. In this case, they had almost, I think, a 1.5 rate of Sultro versus a common rate of Alivo. But I'm going to tell you, I've seen standard rate Sultro, standard rate Alivo have this same kind of pattern show up in the field, where you see a little bit more yellow in the Alivo than Sultro. And I'm going to qualify that, though, by saying that is initially what happens. So I think this is interesting information, that Sultro initially seems to hold stuff off a little bit better, but I'm going to toss out my experience. And again, you can hang your hat on it. So if you put 2 beans out, same bean, you have one treated with Alivo, one treated with Sultro, yes, you will see the Alivo show some symptoms earlier, and the Sultro will seem to hold it off for about 10 to 14 days. But after about 10 to 14 days, if it is severe pressure, the Sultro will crack. It is useful and it is good information. It's better than what we've had, that Sultro will hold it off for that 10, 14 days, just a little bit longer. But it's not enough to solve the problem if we have severe red crown rot in the field. By the end of the season, you're going to see streaks that look like this. Again, notice those are long streaks across the field, right? Almost like they went with the tillage pattern. But you're going to see these dead areas like this. The Saltro will collapse eventually. It's good for holding it off 10 to 14 days, but in a severe case, it's not enough. I'm glad we have it. But again, I think the story is we're going to need something more. Janelle Myers, our seed enhancement lead, had a chance to go out and survey some work on this as well. And you can see in some of the photographs that she took, in the case of this location, the base treatment, Olivo looked a little better than the base, but Saltro looked a little bit better than the Olivo. I wouldn't think even here, though, you'd claim that Saltro is a bright green, right? It's still doing something a little better than the Olivo, but once again, I think it's not going to be enough if we have severe red crown. If we have severe red crown rot, I'm going to just say it now, I'm absolutely convinced we're going to have to come up with varietal tolerance resistance. That is part of what we're going to be doing at Beck's this year, is we're going to be screening varieties to figure out how they stand up against red crown rot. We have a location targeted for that, and hopefully we can come up with some good direction on that here. This is a recent development. John and other members of the Beck's team are familiar with this. This actually came up yesterday at a meeting that we were at. There is a new product that's been put on our seed treatment called Amplitude on every bean that we sell at this point. Amplitude belongs to kind of a unique mode of action family. It's actually a bacteria. And that bacteria, what they think it does is, as near as I can tell, during my hurried look last night through literature, is that it kind of screws up the membranes of a fungus. So it screws up the cell wall, cell membrane, the membranes of the organelles, and it causes the fungus to die. Janelle has kind of thrown out to us, it's new for 25, and that Dr. Carl Bradley sent a note into her saying, at least in one study, and underline that, one study. So do not take this as replicated, as seen it left and right. It's one study, but with this disease, that's the kind of stuff we're going to talk about just to get some hope here. In one study that he looked at, he felt like that Amplitude had decreased red crown rot by 46% and still felt like Saltro was best in the trial at reducing red crown rot by 68%. My qualifier on that real quick, don't take this, even if Amplitude continues to show these kind of results in future studies, don't take this as the final solution for us handling red crown rot. Remember what I said, Saltro is a pretty good product versus red crown rot, but it's only holding it off 10 to 14 days. We aren't getting that full season management the way that we want to. If Amplitude's doing a little bit less than that, kind of keep that in context. I love the idea, though, of having two things that seem to pull back that disease in combination on a soybean. I think part of our battle, at least right now, until we absolutely get varietal tolerance resistance pinned down, is finding ways to decrease the nickeling and diming of this disease. And I will take it. Even if it's not perfect, I will take whatever I can get at this point. Now, I said that I think it's ultimately going to come down to variety. I've hinted that then seed treatment would kind of be the Band-Aid on that, the extra layer of protection that we put on that varietal tolerance. I want to set that aside for a moment because there is one seed treatment out there that I heard about all season long. In my experience, people would talk to me about this, and Janelle had a chance to go out and look at it. It will go by the active ingredient name Timerium. It will go by the product name Victrado for a seed treatment. I gave you a little bit of a qualifier on Amplitude saying do not step out of this thinking it's a slam dunk for solving red crown rot, right? It's one study and it's not doing quite what Saltro is. Still interesting. I'm going to say the same thing in a little different way here. Timerium, the slides I'm going to show you look really, really positive. It's very exciting. We have not decided as a company if this is the direction that we're going. We aren't even there yet. I think we are going to look at it a little bit, of course, with what we're seeing here, but I don't want to promise that this is the next thing coming. I do want to toss it out, though, because if you're in the middle of red crown rot country, you are taking whatever hope you can get. And there are some reasons to have hope here that should give you some hope for the future about what else may be coming, what other things in addition to this may be coming in the future from the industry. Okay, first off, that's Janelle. Janelle is our seed enhancements lead. She has a plant pathology background from the Ohio State University, worked in the pathology plots there. Real quick, you can see her standing there, and you can see that Sultro versus the Czech with red crown rot, that there's an obvious difference in height that kind of takes us back to the Sultro conversation. It is very good to know that Sultro does that. I'm very pleased that we have that on our beans, or as an option that we can put on our beans. Timerium Victrado that she looked at looks like a full launch, not quite yet, maybe a couple years away. But again, some hopeful things here. I mentioned that this belongs to that. I mentioned some other products that belong to the SDHI family, Olivo and Sultro. This belongs to the same family as those. And it looks incredibly promising. And you're beginning to catch just a hint that there's a lot of variability in SDHIs, right? There are some products that are good, in particular on soybean cyst nematode, some products that appear to be especially good on red crown rot. That's kind of the pattern that we're seeing, a lot of diversity in SDHIs, and I would imagine some work that will continue to be done in this space in the future. This is a red crown rot trial with Timerium Victrado. And this is an early September observation. And if you see on the screen green blocks, every one of those green blocks is a Timerium plot. That should begin to pique your interest just a little bit. Second set of observations. Some of these observations were done over in Monticello. So remember what I said, this thing does not just like kind of clay soils. Monticello, Champaign County, we're talking about some flat black ground and a pretty stiff infestation of red crown rot. Look here at Timerium with the check on either side. Again, notice how green that stuff is. This is a story, in my experience, I was hearing all season long. I love this one. Boy, this one shouts out positive things and makes me feel encouraged. This is an early September observation. By early September, I've seen every other seed treatment crack at this point in really bad infestations. This is a pretty stiff infestation, but look at how green it's staying. This is real positive, and this means really good things, I think. Okay, so again, SDHI family, it looks like Sultro's doing a good job holding it off about 10 to 14 days longer. It looks like Timerium may even up it to a much broader, longer season period of control. We'll see what happens there, whether that becomes an avenue we go down in the future. Again, some positive things. That's more information than what we had for people a few years ago. I'm going to close out our discussion by starting to talk about those management considerations that John mentioned. And I'm going to say right here, a lot of this for folks is speculative, right? It's us taking our best guess at this point as to how we can manage the disease, because it's been pretty hard to kind of come up with some solutions. So I'm going to give you my best shot at management ideas at this point, and maybe my best forecast about where we're going to have to go. So there are still a ton of unknowns with this disease. I want to say clearly one more time, manipulating planting date has not, in my experience, been a reliable method to manage this disease. Do not hang your hat on that at this point. Sultro does seem to hold off red crown rot a little longer, but if it's a severe infestation, it's not going to be enough. If you are really hit hard by red crown rot, it will crack by the end. I'm glad we have it. I'm glad it's 10, 14 days. I'm going to take it. I'm going to take anything I get, but it's not going to be enough if it's a bad infestation. Again, I think what we're going to come down to is really varietal selection. This is some recent research that was tossed my way where they actually identified, and this aligns with what we think, goes on in peanuts, right? That we're really varietal tolerance, varietal resistance that we're looking at. They have identified in soybeans, they think, some alleles that help out with red crown rot. And so again, that just kind of tilts this thing towards, that varietal pursuit, that really rating products for how they ward off red crown is going to be important. And that probably is going to be the foundation. It's going to sound a lot, I suspect, like what we're seeing with tar spot, where you kind of look at the hybrid and then you use fungicide on top of the hybrid that you select. Management will ultimately hinge upon varietal tolerance. Again, I think using that Sultro upgrade is a great idea if you have a lot of red crown. I really like the idea that we have amplitude. I put a little tilde in front of that because remember, it's one observation, right? And it's not living up to quite what Sultro does. So don't take it as amplitude being a slam dunk for solving the disease. But once again, I'm going to take whatever I can get. And that Victrato looks really interesting. We'll see what the future looks like there. Here's some other management techniques to close us out. There's been a lot of conversation about cleaning equipment to keep this thing from moving around. And I understand the theory behind that, and it is a great theory. I have some real questions about whether that's a real practical method for us decreasing the movement of this disease. Number one, it is really hard to get every PED off of a piece of equipment. And number two, we tried doing that with soybean cyst nematode, and you saw the map just a little bit ago. Wherever we raise beans in the United States, we've got soybean cyst nematode, and that was old soil movement, or deer running through a field, or water flowing soil. And you also saw some arguments on my part, that I wonder if we're not dusting off some of those microsclerotia and moving those field to field. So I'm not sure cleaning equipment is practical. And I think that's actually important because there may be some of you on the line who are saying, oh man, I should have cleaned off my equipment. Or in some cases, we had growers, understandably so, bleaching their equipment, trying to manage this thing. I think with what we've seen here, it's not really good practically. It didn't really work with soybean cyst nematode. And if it's going airborne, it's going to kind of decide to get to your field anyway. So I wouldn't lose a lot of sleep about whether you cleaned your equipment off or not. If you're going to feel better and be able to put your head on the pillow at night, fine. I don't know if it's going to be long-term really that practical and really that effective for you. I get that, though, if you need to do it just so you can rest easy. But I think it's going to be really hard to decrease the movement of that thing with that practice. A multi-year shift to corn. Remember, we've talked about that we really have some areas that are seeing red crown that aren't prone to corn on corn. That's not a real ideal scenario for them. A multi-year shift to corn, though, has been done in that area. The gentleman who had red crown rot initially that I mentioned, his daughter found it out in the field. I visited with him in the past, and he actually had several years of corn, a few years of corn that he went to, and he felt like he had moved from large regional infestations of red crown in the field, a large geography, to little spots. And so there may be something there. It's not going to solve the problem, though. It's not going to eliminate the problem. But remember, maybe it decreases the nickel and diamine. And at this point, that's the name of the game with this disease, I think, is let's find ways to decrease the nickeling and diamine off of yield. Reducing additional stressors. I do think it's important to have vigorous weed control. Remember, we said it's a wide host range. I do think it's important to have adequate fertility. Even if high fertility predisposed a field to having red crown rot, I'm not going to tell you to pull back fertility. And I think you've got to select a robust disease package. And it kind of goes with that fertility thing. It's not so much that soybean cyst nematode management or managing for SDS or protecting, picking out varieties that have good resistance to Phytophthora and good field tolerance to Phytophthora. It is not so much that managing those is going to stop red crown, but I do want to make sure I don't pile stress on stress. I think that is absolutely critical. One other thing I have down there in the lower right-hand corner, I've had some people do this a little bit, are going to explore this a little bit. Some people are going to try doing wheat just so they can have a different revenue stream on that acre, and then double cropping beans. I don't know how that'll turn out. Dr. Bradley will talk about, he's had some fields where double crop actually got hit pretty hard. Have seen that happen as well, have had that experience as well. So we'll see what happens there, whether that strategy works or not. With that, I'm going to say one more time, I hope that I generated a certain level of well-founded respect for red crown rot, but I want to cry out one more time, no fear mongering. Let's make sure we're not crying wolf. And I say that because if we call everything out in the field red crown rot, we will lull everybody into sleep. And when it arrives, we won't have them paying attention to it. When it arrives, I want and you want people to pay attention to it. So let's get it identified correctly. Be careful about making the claim that the sky is falling, all that kind of stuff. It is a disease that is a big deal. It's worth having respect for. Let's just keep it in perspective a little bit and make sure that we're calling a spade when we see it, so that people actually manage it when they need to and they don't ignore it when it's actually there. One final thing, just my little call out, make sure you're doing right to other people, handing it off better. The world's always a better place when we do that. Here's my contact information. Because this is a new disease, I really would encourage you, those of you on the line, please, your stories are important. That's the only way you learn about a new disease. So I really would encourage you, write down my email address here, and please send us your story about what you're seeing, the kind of yield levels that you're looking at, the things you've wondered about that might be causing it, anything that you have to share. And I really would be interested in that. So please send me some emails, because it's the only way that we as an industry, and that's really what we need to do. We need to battle this as an industry. That's the only way we're going to get around this disease and find a way to manage it. And with that, I'll hand it back to John.
All right, Matt, great presentation. Tons of information there. We do have a few questions from the chat box and the text line. So the first two I'm going to kind of compile together. Is there a point in the season that red crown rot infection would no longer occur? And is there the possibility of disease transfer through the seed beans themselves? Meaning, could this be a seed-borne disease?
Yeah, so let's do the last one first. So technically speaking, that disease should not be growing into the seed, right? It's a root-borne disease. So just the mechanism of it shouldn't be spread by the seed itself. Now, we talked about dusting off and things like that, right? I'm sure you could dream up all sorts of scenarios for how it could somehow get attached to a seed or connected to a seed. But as far as growing into the seed coat itself, it shouldn't be doing that from the way I understand this thing. It's not growing up into the leaves. It's not growing up into the pods. This is a root rot, and it's going to actually degrade that root. And the symptoms and the death that we see are really a result of that root infection. Is there a point where infection levels off? I'm sure there is, but boy, it goes pretty late. Remember what I said. This really infects in the spring. So we've seen it early spring. We've seen it with late planted beans. And I just shared with you that even double crop beans have sometimes been hit by this thing in a severe way. So I'm sure there is a period of time as we're getting towards August where maybe it's taming down just a little bit, but it is a super broad infection period if it can hit even double crop beans.
Is this an obligate biotroph, Matt, where you need a living host in order for it to reproduce?
Yeah, good question. So I think for it producing spores, as I understand it at this point, that's getting produced off of living tissue. So I don't think those spores are getting produced off of anything else. And yes, it is infecting a living plant. as I understand it.
Very good. Another point I think that should be made is part of seed treatment packages protect against soil-borne pathogens and things that are infecting the plant during its life cycle. But another portion of those active ingredients are also help to cleaning seed-borne pathogens. So although we think of seed treatments a lot as protecting against pathogens as that plant's growing and being put in the soil, there is a portion of those active ingredients that are help cleaning up any potential seed-borne pathogens that are there as well. Along those lines, as far as management practices go, I'm going to lump two questions together here. Do you think Xyway at planting, so planter applies fungicide through a 2x2 or FurrowJet wing system, would be an advantage to helping control this disease, as well as are there any products that should be looked at that go after the sclerotia, similar to Contans, something that we would combat white mold with when we get up there? So do you think Xyway is an option, and do you think that those sclerotia-killing fungicides or bactericides could be beneficial in this battle?
So again, all speculative at this point, right? Absolutely zero research on that that I can go back to. There is a lot of interest. I don't know about the killing off microsclerotia. I'm gonna completely set that one aside because I don't know what to tell you there. Maybe, right? I just don't know. But I do know there's a fair amount of interest about something being put down in proximity to the seed, kind of in furrow, for a fungicide, because in peanuts, as I understand it, again, I'm not a peanut production expert, and I'm catching all this from other people, but as I understand it, it's not so much seed treatment they're doing there as much as they're kind of drenching that furrow with some fungicide to hold this thing under control. And so there is a lot of interest in exploring whether fungicides in furrow might help us out. But again, bear in mind, this has only been around since 2018 that we've had it confirmed, and probably only has been a major source of attention the last 3 years, maybe 4. So we're pretty early in the process, and no research that I'm aware of that really answers that at this point. Maybe that's coming, but no research that I'm aware of.
That looks like on my end that we have completed all the questions that came in on the text line and the chat box. I just wanted to say thank you for everybody that took the time to join this. As Matt said, this is an industry battle we have here. So any options, any stories, any ideas that you guys out there have that could help us in the battle against red crown rot would be greatly appreciated. And I can't reiterate it enough. If you feel you have this disease in your area or you're starting to see it, reach out to one member of our agronomy team, reach out to Dr. Montgomery here, or submit samples to the universities, because the more biotypes we can have of this, the more assays that can be done across this disease will lead to quicker management tactics that can help reduce it or suppress it in the area. So again, thank you everybody out there for all your time today. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. And Dr. Montgomery, do you have any closing thoughts here?
No, just really appreciate the time. Fantastic to be able to visit with everybody. And John, just a quick side note, it's a really good time to have a lot of genetic diversity access, because I think that's really one of the big solutions for this disease.
Awesome. Thank you again to everybody out there. This has been recorded, so if you'd like a copy of it, reach out to your local Beck's agronomist, reach out to Matt or myself directly, and we can get you a recording of it. But again, thank you everybody for your time today, and we look forward to sharing more information with you in the future.